What does it actually take to break someone's relationship with the city they call home? Because Sydney, one of the most beautiful coastal cities on Earth, is hemorrhaging residents at a rate the data hasn't seen in decades. Not retirees, not tourists, working-age people, families, millennials in their 30s who did everything right and still can't make the maths work. We're going to break down what's happening, why it's happening now, and where everyone is actually going. This is the story Sydney's tourism board really doesn't want you to hear. 1. The numbers nobody wants to print. Let's start with the data, because the data is staggering. In the 2024 financial year, more than 100,000 residents left Sydney for other parts of Australia. Only 63,000 moved in to replace them. That's a net loss of over 41,000 people in 12 months, nearly triple the loss of the year before. To put that in global context, imagine the entire population of a mid-sized European town packing up and leaving London in a single year. Then imagine it happening again the next year. And the next. Sydney has lost population to other parts of Australia every single year since 1979. But the rate has now exploded. Sydney is currently losing residents at 5 times the rate of Melbourne. 5 times. And here's the part most people miss. Sydney's overall population is still technically growing, but only because overseas migration is masking the bleeding. Strip out the international arrivals, and the harbour city would have shrunk by 0.3% last year. That's the dirty secret behind every Sydney is booming headline you've ever read. The locals are leaving. The newcomers are arriving. And the city is becoming something fundamentally different from what it used to be. Not by design, but by economic force. The Aussie score, net internal loss, 41,086. Acceleration, tripled year over year. Hidden truth, population would be shrinking. The reality, quiet crisis. So what's actually driving the exodus? It starts with a number that doesn't fit on most calculators. 2. The mortgage that math forgot. Sydney's median house price hit roughly 1.62 million Australian dollars in late 2025. That's about 1.04 million US dollars or £820,000 for one house. In a city that now ranks as the world's second least affordable housing market, behind only Hong Kong. To afford the median Sydney house under standard lending rules, you need a household income around 280,000 Australian dollars a year, roughly the top 5% of earners nationally. So the maths is brutally simple. If you're not in the top 5%, you cannot buy the average house in Sydney. Not it's hard. You literally cannot. The deposit timeline tells the same story. A decade ago, the average young person could save a Sydney house deposit in roughly 6 years. Today, that figure has stretched past 12. By the time you've saved the deposit, the house has gone up another 300,000 Australian dollars. For international viewers, Sydney's price-to-income ratio is 13.8. London sits around 8. New York around 7. Even San Francisco comes in lower. This isn't just expensive. It's mathematically broken. Imagine being 30, in a stable job, doing everything your parents told you to do, and realizing the city you grew up in has quietly closed its doors. That's the daily reality for hundreds of thousands of Sydneysiders. And they've started doing the only thing the maths leaves them, leaving. The Aussie score, median price, 1.62 million Australian dollars. Income required, 280,000 Australian dollars. Deposit timeline, 12 plus years. The reality, mathematically impossible. But the cost of buying isn't even the worst part. The cost of staying might be. 3. The 90-minute life. Here's what nobody tells you about the people who do manage to stay. They're paying for the privilege with their time. Sydney's outer suburbs. The only places remaining where the median house price drops below the catastrophic are 60 to 90 minutes from the CBD on a good day. 2 hours each way on a bad one. That's not a commute. That's a part-time job you don't get paid for. Do the maths. A 2-hour daily commute, 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year, equals 500 hours. That's 21 full days. 3 weeks of your life. Gone to sitting in a car or on a train. Every single year. 4 decades. For the rest of your working life. The young families being squeezed out of inner Sydney into Marsden Park, Box Hill, Leppington, and the new Western Corridors aren't choosing those suburbs because they want to. They're choosing them because the only affordable option in Sydney comes packaged with a daily commute that quietly destroys their relationships, their health, and their sanity. Imagine living this. You leave the house at 6:30 a.m. while your kids are still asleep. You get home at 7 p.m. If traffic cooperates. You see your children for 90 minutes on a weeknight, half of which is spent rushing through dinner and bedtime. The weekend becomes the only window in which you actually exist as a family, and half of it gets eaten by errands you couldn't run during the week. This isn't a lifestyle. It's an endurance test. And that's the part the property brochures never mention. The houses might be technically affordable in Sydney's far west, but the human cost, measured in hours, in stress, in lost time with your family, is what eventually breaks people. It's not one thing that pushes Sydneysiders out. It's the slow accumulation of every small surrender, until one day, the spreadsheet finally wins the argument. The Aussie score, daily commute, up to 4 hours, annual time lost, 21 plus days, quality of life, quietly collapsing. The reality, time bankruptcy, which raises the obvious question, who exactly is leaving? Because the answer isn't who you'd expect. 4. The generation that gave up. The exodus isn't being led by retirees chasing sunshine. It's being led by people in their 30s, millennials with stable careers, young families, and exactly the demographic profile a healthy city desperately needs to retain. These are the people who studied in Sydney, started their careers in Sydney, met their partners in Sydney, did everything they were told to do, and then ran straight into a wall of unaffordability that no amount of effort could climb over. Research from the E61 Institute confirms it. People in their 30s are dramatically overrepresented in those leaving, exactly the age when families start needing more space and asking harder questions about the future. The generational shift is brutal. In 2001, 43% of 25 to 29-year-olds in Australia owned their own home. Today, that number has collapsed to 36%. And in Sydney specifically, the figure is dramatically worse. Owning a home in your 20s has gone from a normal life milestone to a near impossibility for anyone without family wealth. For international viewers, this pattern probably sounds painfully familiar. The same dynamic is playing out in London, Toronto, Vancouver, Auckland, and most major Western cities. A generation that's better educated than any before it is being systematically locked out of the basic asset that built every previous generation's wealth. What makes Sydney different is the speed and scale of the response. People aren't just complaining anymore. They're voting with their feet. And here's the cruel irony of the data. The people leaving Sydney are precisely the people the city most needs to keep. Skilled workers in their prime earning years. Young parents with decades of tax contributions ahead of them. The exact demographic that builds neighbourhoods, pays mortgages, and powers a local economy. Sydney is losing them, and it's losing them faster every year. The Aussie score, demographic hit. 30s overrepresented. Young home ownership. Collapsing. Skill drain. Accelerating. The reality, generational walkout. So if they're not staying, where are they actually going? The answer is changing the map of Australia. 5. The Great Northern Escape. Of the 100,000 people who walked out of Sydney last year, the single biggest destination wasn't another major city. It was Queensland. Roughly 30,000 ex-Sydneysiders moved north in a single year, chasing warmer weather, lower prices, and a property market where their Sydney equity could finally buy them an actual life. The Gold Coast, the Sunshine Coast, Brisbane's outer corridors, Townsville, Toowoomba, Bowen, suburbs and towns where a former Sydney apartment owner can sell their tiny inner west unit and walk into a 4-bedroom house with a pool and still have money left over. The same money that bought you a bedroom in Sydney now buys you a lifestyle north of the border. Regional New South Wales picked up another 10,000 people. The Hunter Valley, the Illawarra, the South Coast, the Northern Rivers. Coastal towns and inland centres that have been quietly absorbing Sydney refugees for years and turning into genuine alternatives. Not consolation prizes. Imagine being part of this migration. You sell your apartment in Marrickville for 900,000 Australian dollars. You buy a 4-bedroom house on a 1/4-acre block in Bowen, on the Queensland coast, for 520,000 Australian dollars. You pocket the difference, nearly 400,000 Australian dollars, and use it to clear debt, build savings, or simply give yourself room to breathe for the first time in a decade. Your commute drops from 90 minutes to 12. Your kids get a backyard. Your weekends stop being a desperate scramble to recover from the working week. That's the trade. And once you've seen the maths laid out like that, the only real question is why anyone hesitates. The Aussie score, Queensland gain, 30,000 Sydneysiders. Regional NSW gain, 10,000 plus. Direction of money, north. The reality, mass relocation. But none of this would have been possible without one massive change that quietly broke Sydney's grip on its own residents. 6. The catalyst that changed everything. For most of Sydney's history, the city had a hostage advantage. The jobs were here. If you wanted a serious career in finance, tech, media, or law, you had to live within commuting distance of the CBD. You paid the absurd housing premium because the alternative was career suicide. The pandemic broke that deal. Permanently. Remote work didn't just become possible. It became normalized across exactly the white-collar industries that anchored Sydney's economy. Suddenly, the question wasn't, can I keep my job if I move? It was, why am I paying Sydney prices when I'm only in the office 2 days a week? Without remote work, the exodus would have remained a slow trickle. The historical pattern Sydney has run since 1979. With it, the trickle became a generational wave. Professionals in their prime earning years could take their Sydney salary and combine it with regional housing prices. The arbitrage was too obvious to ignore. This isn't unique to Australia. The same dynamic has reshaped New York commuter towns, entered parts of San Francisco, and pushed London professionals into the Cotswolds. Anywhere a major western city became unaffordable, remote work handed residents the keys to the exit. Sydney's housing pressure was just so extreme that the response became more dramatic than anywhere else. The Aussie score, remote work adoption, permanent, geographic constraint, broken, exodus velocity, accelerated. The reality, game changer. Which leaves only one question, and it's the one nobody in Sydney's property industry once asked out loud. 7. The truth nobody wants to say. Here's the part the headlines won't tell you. Sydney isn't dying. It's becoming something different. A city where the established middle class, teachers, nurses, tradespeople, young families, the people who actually make a city function, can no longer afford to live, while the population is constantly refilled by newcomers who haven't yet realized what they've signed up for. It's a revolving door dressed up as growth. And the door spins faster every year. The exodus is a verdict. Not on Sydney's beauty or its lifestyle or its history. It's still one of the most stunning coastal cities on Earth. The verdict is on the maths. When the numbers stop working for an entire generation, that generation eventually leaves. And no amount of harbour views can change a calculator. For international viewers watching this, the lesson goes well beyond Sydney. Every major western city is running a version of this same experiment. London, Toronto, Auckland, Vancouver. The cities that figure out how to keep their young people will thrive. The ones that don't will end up with exactly what Sydney has now. Beautiful skylines, hollowed out middles, and a generation that quietly chose somewhere else. The Aussie score, cost, generational, trend, accelerating, solution, nowhere in sight. The reality, a city at a crossroads. 100,000 people don't leave a city by accident. They leave because the maths finally beats the love. Sydney's exodus isn't a property story. It's a warning shot about what happens when housing costs decouple from human reality. If you want to see exactly where these Sydney refugees are landing, go watch 7 Queensland towns that are quietly booming and cheap. It's the other side of this exact story. See you in the next one.